But we learn in time of pestilence that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. And a number doesn't represent death.
Exactly.
It doesn't represent the suffering, that awful suffering leading up to death. Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of reoccurring in the world. Yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise.
Hello, welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful, great works of literature.
While dressed in elegant clothing, because...
Why the hell not? Alright, so we decided to do a rather unwise move, and we decided to read Albert Camus' The Plague in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah, because why wouldn't we want to surround ourselves more with pestilences?
That's right, exactly. and even in the dead of winter as well. It's not like it's like, you know, particularly warm summer evenings, and it's not a book conducive to that sort of atmosphere. So we could just start off with a little biographical note. Camus, he was born in Algeria in 1913, and he died at 46, quite tragically, in a car accident. He's also known for his existentialist philosophy. It's more like absurdist philosophy. This is something that after World War II, this became quite in vogue in French intellectual circles. He never really considered himself an existentialist. I think he really didn't like labels, period, and he didn't particularly enjoy that label. But his whole philosophical attitude is in line with Jean-Paul Sartre and a lot of the other existentialist thinkers of the 20th century. And so a lot of people during that period, since this was written in 1947, actually took this as an allegory to to France's to the Nazi occupation of France, really.
Yeah, and is it correct? We don't really know.
Yeah, the introduction actually goes into a little bit more of a broader view, and a lot of the analyses, especially when we're moving on further past that period in time, they're taking a very global perspective of it. And he didn't really align himself with any sort of political messaging or political party.
Yeah.
So I think even the existentialists, a lot of them kind of like were upset because they were very much like on the left wing sort of type of political spectrum. And he kind of did not want to attribute, you know, a political stance. It's moral, there's a moralistic stance here, but not a political one. So there's...
And also wasn't he speaking to like some true life experience where he was having some sort of physical ailment in... What was it?
I think he was like, I think because of the occupation, he was kind of stranded in a small town that was similar to the one here.
But he had some sort of illness and he wasn't able to go bathing in the ocean.
Oh yeah.
And that was his one like freedom he felt like he could have, and they restricted people from going into the ocean. So he felt especially trapped, which leads to kind of a similarity in the town of Oran? In that the book's set in. So I had a kind of a quote also that just two quotes that I thought would be nice to open up with, and then we can move forward. So the first one was, I thought that this was kind of interesting. So this is after one of the priests in the town had given a sermon. And it said, "To some, the sermon simply brought home the fact that they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. And while a good many people adapted themselves to confinement and carried on their humdrum lives as before, there were others who rebelled, and whose one idea now was to break loose from the prison house." And then the second quote that I just wanted to say was, "But we learn in time of pestilence that there are more things to admire in men than to despise." And I thought that was a lovely way to kind of summarize how, despite the suffering and everything we've all gone through, I think we've also learned a lot to admire about people through this.
To always keep that at the forefront of our minds, I suppose, no matter how tumultuous it gets, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Very true. So the story is set in a fictional town called Oran, and it's kind of like a provincial, like it's like a prefecture, like a French prefecture essentially, and it's like every other sort of somewhat cosmopolitan town, but people's interests are very surface level, very superficial.
It's like there's clearly not a lot of passion or soul, because it's like there's no trees, there's no plants, the town is back is to the ocean, so no one even cares about the ocean.
Yeah.
And they just joke
situated.
that the only way you can actually see flowers is by the people putting their flowers in their flower pot that they purchased from the local florist. So it kind of just gives this funny opening to this really humdrum town.
And it's a sense of like people who've completely lost a sense of how to live and what living is about. And in many ways, like, I'd imagine like they were almost in a way like spiritually dead even before the plague hit and started wreaking havoc in a way, right? So that's how I kind of saw it. Anyway, so one of the things is the rats start to emerge and they start growing in number, and there's piles and piles of rats at a certain point just dying. So this, I would imagine, like bubonic plague has come in and it starts kind of like decimating the population
of rats, yeah.
Of rats, and then it very quickly spreads into human beings. And right away, people just assume and hope that it's just, a few cases and it's going to go away, and we can just go on living our lives the way we used to live our lives. And Dr. Rieu, who is the protagonist of the story, one of a number of characters that you actually follow throughout the novel, knows already that something bad is coming, right? Something major is coming. But the thing about Dr. Rieu is he's kind of like an aspect of Albert Camus, and Tarot and Rambert, all these different characters, they seem to echo a lot of his philosophical thoughts and his emotional stance on things. I think even Tarot was talking about capital punishment and how he was really against, taking a person's life for having committed murder or something along those lines. Sort of like a very liberal attitude. And so that was something that Albert Camus was also very passionate about. So he put that through his character Tarot, who's like the more sensitive of the bunch. And so Dr. Rieu takes a very absurdist, I suppose, philosophical approach to suffering, doesn't he? In a way.
Did you have a quote?
Oh yeah. It's like the habit of despair is worse than despair itself. And so one of the things that Camus, he had written previously to this novel, was an essay, a longer philosophical essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus is, because of his punishments, the gods actually made him push a boulder up a hill. And the moment he's about to get to the top, or he reaches the top, the boulder kind of like falls back down to the bottom, and he has to do it over and over and over again. Almost like this mindless, meaningless task that he's kind of condemned to repeat for all of eternity, right? But then he asks, like, Sisyphus is smiling though. Like, what if Sisyphus is still happy regardless of what he's going through and the torment that he has to do, right? And that's kind of the absurdist attitude. It's like, regardless of the meaninglessness or the chaos or the absolute presence of suffering in life, all we can do is to carry on doing things in a quiet way, not even necessarily like a bold, dramatic, heroic way, but in the quiet responsibilities that we all do just to alleviate the suffering of our fellow man. And so Dr. Rieu's attitude is very much along those lines. He just kind of like keeps his head down, his nose to the grindstone, and he does what's within his capacity to do to help the suffering of others, without falling into despair himself, and without hoping necessarily. Like, neither of those two extremes does he kind of hold on to. He just kind of takes this very like. And
I think that's kind of what hit me. It was like, well, you have kind of two choices when you're stuck. You either hold on to the despair and let yourself succumb to it, and then what ends up happening, you die anyway, right?
Yeah.
But you die miserable and probably providing misery around everyone around you, or you continue to do something, and perhaps that something may help at an individual level, may not totally stop the pestilence or plague from happening, but at least you've joined together with your fellow human beings to survive and to find meaning, rather than just living day in despair.
Yeah.
And regretting the things you once had, or missing the things you once had.
Yeah. And there's also like a strong sense in which, like, for example, the journalist Rambert wanted to, he wasn't from the town, and he wanted to escape because his loved one was actually, I think she was in Paris or something. She was in Paris, and so he was trying all this sort of sketchy ways, I guess, to escape the town, past the authorities and the guard that surrounds the perimeter of this town in quarantine. And you know, he was always kind of worried about committing a cowardice, like an act of cowardice. And so he always struggled with that, his moral conscience in a way. It's like, for my own personal individual happiness, must I, you know, run away and go to my loved one and leave everything behind, all these other people behind? And finally, you know, Dr. Rieu, like, he let him make that choice, but finally, when it came down to it, he ended up staying and joining the health groups, and
he would waver back and forth with this conundrum. Like, he'd be like, well, if I left and I went to be with her, then I just always had this guilt in my heart about leaving, and then what if I got her sick? And then on the other hand, he was like, well, if I stay and then I never am with my love, what was the point of living here? So he struggled with this idea of trying to find meaning where he was.
Yeah. So all of these characters are rather courageous, except Cottard.
Yeah.
So you want to talk a little bit about Cottard?
So Cottard was this like kind of interesting character. He's just out of the. He was the one character who seemed to be totally contrary to what everyone else was. So before, everyone seemed to at least appear to be content in their life, right, with their material kind of
and their pursuits.
Yeah, and distractions, and you know, and he, in the beginning, before the pestilence tried to kill himself, he was trying to hang himself, and then one of the other characters rescued him. And then during the pestilence, this totally changed. I know everyone was like kind of concerned about him at first, like, oh geez, if he was bad before, how is he going to be now? And all of a sudden there's this like flip, and he becomes this kind of extortionist and is bringing in goods illegally and benefiting from that, and he's just beaming with this material success for the first time in his life, so he's ecstatic about it and kind of worried that it eventually will end.
And he doesn't want the epidemic to end.
No, but he's not malicious enough that like he would actually cause it to continue. So that part of it you can kind of find a humorous light, but at the same time you're like, okay, but he's kind of this like schemy, gross character in a way that, you know, everyone else is suffering and doing their part. And I guess in a way he is, because he's bringing in goods, otherwise that probably wouldn't get there. But to benefit off and profit off of everyone else's suffering was something a bit disturbing too.
And he has a very bizarre end, the end of the story, but we won't get into that. But you have to read it for yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. So what else? The aspect of decency as well is something that came up in a very like essential conversation between Tarou and Dr. Rieu.
Yeah, where he says it's something along the lines of, do you have the quote there? No.
I don't have the quote.
It was something along the lines of like, you know, it's better to not try to be a hero, but actually just live a life of decency, which does kind of fall under the absurdism.
And like decency in the sense of like a quietness. Like there's a heroic, bombastic element, you know, but you know.
And then there's the people who are quietly behind the scenes, seeing really the suffering and suffering along with them, but doing their part and not feeling like they have to claim some sort of reward for it, right? Which was interesting because there's a component of the book. Sorry, I took over. There was a component of the book where at first they were trying to get people to join their like kind of force to help.
The health teams.
Yeah, they call it the health teams, which I think is hilarious because we use that term a lot in the medical world. But anyway, they were trying to have these like health teams, which really I kind of saw similar to what we see during this crisis, where people are being kind of pulled and out of their regular job in healthcare and then sent onto different jobs that maybe are out of their norm, right? So that's a similar idea to the health teams in this book. But at first they were trying to get people to join by giving them rewards, and then eventually like medals of distinction or something like that. But then at first everyone was kind of like fighting for this award, and then over time that award really meant nothing anymore when there was no end in sight as soon as they thought it would. So it just, again, it kind of went to this point of like, if you're trying to do it just for that literal badge or award of, oh, I did my part in, you know, helping end this epidemic, it's like, well, the epidemic, it's going to go on its own course whether you get an award or not, right? Yeah. So like that's not a good motive to continue to help people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess like the thing is, I guess one of the points I want to make was like the sense of decency and the quietness of just people in the background doing their everyday jobs in order to keep, you know, keep food on the table, keep whatever, the water clean, all those different things that nobody really thinks about in a heroic sense, but are very fundamental and important. These are the quiet things that redeem man, right? That redeem man and humanity as well. You know, these are the unsung actions, the smallest things. And you know what that kind of reminds me of is Stifter. Albert Stifter. We covered some of his Motley Stone's stories, and how, you know, it's the small things, the things that we think insignificant and we don't find particularly dramatic or exciting. These things, you know, hold the fabric of the cosmos in place. And same with the smallest things of human action and compassion and sympathy and empathy.
But it also is like, even if you don't want to take it from this lens of like necessarily helping someone else, it's like through that presence of mind, by like sitting and actually just coming to terms with what's happening, you have more learning. Like that reminds me of the priest, where at first he was very, in this story, like very blaming and shaming of all of the city, like, this is your doing, you were all materialistic and now God's punishing you and you brought this upon yourself, and then kind of made everyone really fearful of all the actions they've done, and all it did is create terror within the city. And then over time he started to see things from a different light, that, you know, it didn't matter who you were, this pestilence would take you. Yeah. It didn't matter, you know, take children, take anyone. And did you want to?
No, carry on. That was, yeah.
And then his death, like, maybe you want to describe his death.
Well, his death, he kind of like, I felt like there was a real cosmic struggle within the man himself, that tension, and you know, he kind of like, when he realized that he had contracted the illness, he was dying, he just kind of like, he accepted it, but bravely. I found, like, very bravely and courageously he accepted it, and like he didn't allow himself to fall into despair either. Like, there was a strength to his character.
So this is what I found very interesting, was like, so before he contracted it, he did this like very, probably like the best sermon he actually had ever done, where it talked about, like, he, and even himself, like, you know, it was the first time that everyone all of a sudden went back to the church and started to have hope that they would overcome this disease, and that they were starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. And the sermon, essentially, you can add in anything that you think I might be missing, but essentially it was that, you know, we've all suffered, even if it attacks anyone at any point in time, that in itself is a lesson, that it can take anyone, and that suffering is unavoidable, it comes out of nowhere, and we can see it as he said, like, I had incorrectly seen it as a punishment from God, when actually it's a blessing in a way, because before we lived these lives where we felt it was inevitable that this happiness and contentment would come, and in fact we just we didn't even appreciate what we had. Now upon the suffering, we hold our loved ones dearly. We find a path of meaning within them. We've come together and we've joined, and he's like, although that suffering's horrible and you don't want that to happen, it did also bring something else with it. And then what was interesting was, like, he did that sermon, he left the place where he had lived, and he almost called upon the disease upon himself. Like, he went to this new building, remember? And everyone was like, why are you crazy? You're moving in the middle of, like, when it's almost over, and, you know, if you just stay in your home, you haven't caught anything, why would you move to a new place that could be infected? And he goes, and sure enough, he gets infected, and then he dies. But like you were saying, as he's dying, he's not unlike many of the other people who are, like, grasping onto life. He obviously, like, in a way, almost just felt like it was his time to go, you know?
I just found, like, for all of his development and, you know, the meaning attached to the suffering that he espouses, and it was just very sad in a way. The way, and this is an interesting sort of, like, I guess, interesting take, is that Dr. Rio pronounces his death and records him as a number, like yet another statistic to be recorded. And it just seems to on the outside to almost like negate that huge struggle and the huge overwhelming sort of this
like personal
cosmic development and transcendence and all these different amazing transformative elements, right? In the man's
whether for good or for
life.
bad, like a number doesn't represent death.
Exactly.
It doesn't represent the suffering, that awful suffering leading up to death, what everyone had to do to try to prevent the suffering, which it still happened, the inevitable still happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's just a stat, a number. And,
exactly.
And it was just interesting too, because it was like, he, even in this, he said, you know, eventually you became numb to the numbers.
That's the next point that we wanted to say. Where but then people became really numb. Exactly, they didn't mean anything. Like the constant reiteration of the number of dead. You know, the statistics that were recorded and kind of like put out into the loudspeakers or in the newsboys.
Yeah.
It didn't mean anything at a certain point.
Yeah, because it was like the natural tendency of that virus was to go up and to go down, up and to down. So eventually people would be like, at first, you know, there was hope when the numbers would start to drop, and then they'd climb again, and people would be like, oh, great. And then it would drop, right? Sound familiar? Like climb and then drop, and then climb and then drop, and then climb and then drop. So eventually people just stopped believing in them. And they were just like, well, what is this comparing to? How is this helpful for me
a sense of
to continue to go on?
Yeah.
And it was interesting, that juxtaposition of the extreme meaningful transformation that this priest went through, from being very like by the book, you know, by the church, like, and yet when he really found a transformational and meaningful change in his life, and then he dies, and that's not written anywhere. You know, his sermon just kind of disappeared into the ether. Sorry, no one really took anything from it, and he just is another number.
Yeah, and I found there was such a pity there. There was such a shame, you know. It's just like, and it's so true.
But not for him.
Not
it's
for
him.
Everyone
else, right?
That's right. Yeah,
It's like for him, he's like, I had my purpose.
That's right. Exactly. So one last thing I guess I wanted to bring up was this idea. So, you know, a lot of intellectuals were at the time around this period, or very shortly after this book was published, kind of like imagine this as an allegory for Nazi-occupied France, right? And one thing that's absolutely made clear, even by sort of the editor, right, who wrote the introduction for this, is that, you know, the plague resides within every single human being, we're constantly within the plague. It doesn't matter whether it's, you know, the plague of 1667, the bubonic plague of the 6th century. It doesn't matter. It's not that particular plague. It is the plague, and the plague that we carry with us. And that plague, in a sense, is the fact that, you know, at any given moment in our lives, we walk around almost with this like uncertainty with regard to how much time we have left on this planet. Like, something can happen to us tomorrow. A disease can take us away. We can have an accident. You know, we could be murdered. All these different things could happen. And this is kind of like, it's the plague is, how would you describe that? Would you describe that as like coping with life, or the uncertainty of life, the absurdity of life?
I think it's just, even just like, there's things we can't control, right? It's like, we can try to eradicate things as best we can as they come up, and that in itself is a wonderful ambition to have, but to think that it will always be over, it never will. There'll always be something new.
You can never always be safe. You know, there's like security and safety.
That's a very utopian dream, right? Like, there'll always be something that will come.
And so I think it was very fitting for the book to end in a very.
I have a quote too. You have one?
Yeah. Well, this is the last one. So, indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy that rose above the town, Rio recalled that this joy was always under threat. He knew that this happy crowd was unaware of something that one can read in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, that it can remain dormant for dozens of years in furniture or clothing, that it waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, and old papers, and that perhaps the day will come when, for the instruction or misfortune of mankind, the plague will rouse its wraths and send them to die in some well-contented city.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's so true of the plague in a biological manner, but this is also the plague that we carry with us. This is a deeply existential plague as well.
Yeah, I think this is also a good kind of quote too. Is everybody knows that pestilences have a way of reoccurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. We tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away, but it doesn't always pass away. From one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away. Yeah.
Well. So yeah, I mean, you know, we're it like it says, like we're never immune to this plague.
Maybe you'll want to, you know, when things calm down with the pandemic, you know, in years to come, and you want to teach your children about what you experienced, you could read this book to them.
Why not? Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it while you're amidst it. I think it was sometimes hard to.
It's like, when you get bombarded by that all day, it's the last thing you want to do in your off time and relaxation time is to delve into yet another instance of the exact same scenario. So, or at least a very similar scenario.
But anyway, we can all hang on. We can all make it through, and eventually these things do at least, maybe not never completely die, but become livable.
Yeah.
And
yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining us again. And we hope you enjoyed this book. If you have thoughts, comments, perhaps you studied Albert Camus on more of a philosophical, intellectual level or literary level, you can let us know your thoughts and comments. Very much so.
Yeah. As always, have a good night and thanks for being here.
All right. You take care then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.